The silence in the opulent Seoul apartment was thick enough to choke on. Eun-woo, heartthrob actor and reluctant single father, stared out the panoramic window, the city lights blurring into a meaningless kaleidoscope of color. He'd just fired Mrs. Kim, his son Minjun's nanny of 3 years. 3 years of supposed stability, 3 years of believing he was providing the best care possible for his son. I can't anymore, he'd said, his voice cracking with a mixture of guilt and simmering rage. Mrs. Kim, her face a mask of practiced indifference, had simply nodded and gathered her belongings. No arguments, no pleas, just a chilling acceptance that had only fueled Eun-woo's unease. Min-jun, his son, was different. Diagnosed with autism at an early age, his world was a carefully constructed fortress of routine and repetition. Changes, even small ones, could trigger meltdowns that left Eun-woo feeling helpless and inadequate. That's why Mrs. Kim had been so crucial, a constant, a familiar face in Min-jun's often turbulent world. But Eun-woo had seen something. A flicker of impatience in Mrs. Kim's eyes when Min-jun became fixated on lining up his toy cars. A too firm grip on Min-jun's arm when he refused to eat his vegetables. Subtle things, almost imperceptible, but they chipped away at Eun-woo's trust until it finally crumbled. He couldn't risk Min-jun's well-being, not even for the sake of maintaining the status quo. He turned from the window, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Min-jun was sitting at his small art table, meticulously coloring a picture. The usual mess of crayons and paper scraps surrounded him, a familiar comfort in the sterile environment of the modern apartment. "Hey, buddy," Eun-woo said softly, approaching his son. Min-jun didn't look up, his brow furrowed in concentration. The rhythmic scratching of the crayon against the paper was the only sound in the room. Eun-woo knelt beside him, trying to decipher the drawing. It was a chaotic swirl of colors, seemingly random, but Eun-woo knew better. Min-jun's art was his language, his way of expressing the emotions he couldn't articulate with words. He saw a figure in the center, rendered in harsh, jagged lines. A woman. Mrs. Kim. But something was off. The woman's face was obscured by a dark scribble, and a menacing red crayon slashed across the paper, connecting her to a smaller, stick figure representation of Min-jun. Eun-woo's breath caught in his throat. He'd seen Min-jun draw Mrs. Kim before, usually in bright, cheerful colors. This was different. This was fear. "What's this, Min-jun?" he asked gently, pointing to the red slash. Min-jun flinched, pulling away from the drawing. He didn't answer, but his eyes darted nervously towards the hallway, towards the now empty room that had been Mrs. Kim's. Eun-woo's heart pounded. He had suspected something, a nagging feeling that Mrs. Kim wasn't as patient and caring as she portrayed. But this was a child's raw, unfiltered truth, laid bare on a piece of paper. He had to know. He had to understand what Min-jun was trying to tell him. "Show me," Eun-woo whispered, taking Min-jun's hand. "Show me what happened, Min-jun." "It's okay. I'm here." Min-jun stiffened, his small hand trembling in Eun-woo's. The actor's carefully constructed world of calm and control threatened to shatter. He needed to tread carefully, to coax the truth from Min-jun without causing further distress. He released Min-jun's hand, reaching instead for a fresh sheet of paper and a box of crayons. He placed them in front of his son. "Okay, buddy. New picture. Show Appa. Draw what you want to show me." Min-jun hesitated, his gaze flitting between Eun-woo and the blank paper. Finally, he picked up a blue crayon and began to draw. The initial strokes were tentative, shaky lines that gradually gained confidence. He drew the apartment, the familiar layout sketched with surprising accuracy. He drew himself, a simple stick figure with a disproportionately large head. Then, he drew Mrs. Kim. This time, the figure of Mrs. Kim wasn't a chaotic mess of scribbles. It was more defined, more deliberate. She was standing in the kitchen, her back to Min-jun. He added details Eun-woo hadn't noticed before, the way Mrs. Kim always wore her hair pulled back tight, the way her shoulders were always slightly hunched. Then, Min-jun picked up a black crayon. He drew a small object in Mrs. Kim's hand. At first, Eun-woo couldn't make it out. It was a small rectangle, held at an odd angle. Then, he realized. It was Minjun's tablet, the one he used for his learning games and calming apps. Minjun drew Mrs. Kim holding the tablet high above her head, out of reach. He then drew himself reaching for it, his small arms outstretched, his face contorted in a silent scream. Eun-woo's blood ran cold. He remembered countless times finding Minjun upset, the tablet nowhere in sight. He'd always assumed Minjun had simply misplaced it, lost in his own world. He'd scolded Minjun gently, reminding him to be more careful. Now, he realized the truth. Mrs. Kim had been using the tablet as a form of punishment, withholding it when Minjun didn't behave as she wanted. He forced himself to remain calm. And then what happened, Minjun? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Minjun dropped the black crayon and picked up a green one. He drew Mrs. Kim walking away, leaving him alone in his room. He drew a door, closed and locked. He drew himself curled up on the floor, surrounded by a jumble of his discarded toys. The image was heartbreaking. Eun-woo's stomach churned with a mixture of guilt and fury. He had entrusted his son to this woman, believing she was providing him with a safe and nurturing environment. Instead, she had been isolating him, manipulating him, and exploiting his vulnerabilities. He pulled Minjun close, hugging him tightly. It's okay, Minjun. Appa is here. Appa will always protect you. Minjun buried his face in Eun-woo's chest, his small body trembling. For the first time in a long time, Eun-woo felt a connection with his son, a deep understanding that transcended words. He understood the fear in Minjun's eyes, the unspoken pain he had been carrying for so long. He knew he couldn't let this go. He couldn't simply fire Mrs. Kim and pretend it never happened. He had to find out the full extent of her abuse, to ensure she never harmed another child. But how? He was a famous actor, his life constantly under scrutiny. Any investigation into Mrs. Kim would be splashed across the tabloids, exposing Minjun to even more unwanted attention. He had to be careful, to proceed with caution. He decided to start with the obvious. He needed to talk to Mrs. Kim, to confront her with Minjun's drawings and see her reaction. He knew it was a risk, that she might deny everything or try to manipulate him. But he had to try. He gently detached himself from Minjun and stood up. Stay here, buddy. Appa needs to make a phone call. He walked into his study, closing the door behind him. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Mrs. Kim's number. He hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, he took a deep breath and pressed the call button. The phone rang several times before she answered. Yeobaseo? Her voice was cold and distant, just as he remembered. Mrs. Kim, it's Eun-woo, he said, his voice firm. I need to talk to you. Can you come back to the apartment? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I don't think that's a good idea, Mr. Cha. You made it very clear yesterday that my services were no longer required. This is not about my requirements, Mrs. Kim. This is about Minjun. I need to ask you some questions about how you treated him. He could hear her breathing quicken on the other end of the line. I always treated Minjun with the utmost care and respect. I don't know what you're talking about. I have drawings, Mrs. Kim. Drawings that tell a very different story. I know about the tablet. I know about the locked doors. I know about the fear you instilled in my son. Her voice turned sharp. Those are just drawings, Mr. Cha. Children's fantasies. You're reading too much into them. Am I? Or are you afraid of what I might find out if I dig a little deeper? He paused, letting his words sink in. Come back to the apartment, Mrs. Kim. We can talk about this like adults. Or I can take these drawings to the police and let them decide what they mean. He could hear her gasp. You wouldn't dare. Try me, Eun-woo said, his voice cold. I'll be waiting. He hung up the phone, his hand trembling. He had no idea if Mrs. Kim would actually come back, but he had to try. He had to protect Minjun, no matter the cost. He returned to Min-jun, who was still sitting at the art table, staring at his drawings. Eun-woo knelt beside him, wrapping his arm around his son's shoulders. "Everything is going to be okay, Min-jun, he whispered. Appa is going to make sure of it." He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and uncertainties. But he was ready to face them, for Min-jun. He was no longer just a famous actor, living a superficial life. He was a father, and he would do whatever it took to protect his son. As he waited for Mrs. Kim, Eun-woo started to think about other seemingly insignificant events that now seemed suspicious. Mrs. Kim had always been insistent on handling Min-jun's meals herself, claiming she knew his dietary needs best. Had she been controlling his food intake as another form of punishment? He recalled Min-jun often being unusually quiet and withdrawn after spending time alone with Mrs. Kim, attributing it to his autistic tendencies. Now, he wondered if it was fear and anxiety. He also remembered several instances where Min-jun had come home with unexplained bruises. Mrs. Kim had always dismissed them as accidental bumps and scrapes, common for a child with sensory processing issues. But now, Eun-woo couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister had been going on. He decided to review the security footage from the cameras he had installed throughout the apartment. He had rarely checked them, trusting Mrs. Kim implicitly. Now, he realized how foolish he had been. He accessed the footage on his computer, his hands trembling as he navigated through the files. He started with the most recent recordings, focusing on the times when Min-jun was alone with Mrs. Kim. The footage was grainy and the sound was muffled, but he could clearly see Mrs. Kim interacting with Min-jun. At first, everything seemed normal. She was reading him stories, helping him with his puzzles, and playing games with him. But as he watched more closely, he began to notice subtle signs of impatience and frustration. He saw her rolling her eyes when Min-jun struggled with a task, sighing heavily when he became fixated on a particular toy, and snapping at him when he didn't follow her instructions. Then, he found it. A recording from a week ago, showing Mrs. Kim in Min-jun's room. Min-jun was having a meltdown, screaming and crying and throwing his toys around. Mrs. Kim stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face a mask of cold indifference. She didn't try to comfort him, to soothe him, or to help him regulate his emotions. She simply watched him, her eyes filled with disdain. After several minutes, she finally approached him. But instead of offering him a hug or a kind word, she grabbed him by the arm and dragged him into his closet, slamming the door shut behind him. Eun-woo gasped, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. He fast-forwarded the footage, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He saw Mrs. Kim unlock the closet door after what felt like an eternity. Min-jun emerged, his face tear-streaked, his body trembling. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were filled with a profound sadness that Eun-woo had never seen before. He watched as Mrs. Kim led Min-jun back to his room, forcing him to sit at his art table and draw. She stood behind him, watching him intently, her presence looming over him like a dark cloud. Eun-woo slammed his laptop shut, his hands shaking so violently he could barely control them. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him, and he stumbled to the bathroom, where he vomited into the toilet. He had seen enough. He knew the truth. Mrs. Kim was not the caring and compassionate nanny he had believed her to be. She was a monster who had preyed on his son's vulnerability and inflicted emotional and psychological abuse. He washed his face and returned to Min-jun, his eyes filled with a newfound determination. He would not let Mrs. Kim get away with this. He would expose her for who she was, and he would make sure she never harmed another child. Just then, the doorbell rang. Eun-woo took a deep breath, steeling himself for the confrontation to come. It was time to face Mrs. Kim, and he was ready. He opened the door, his expression carefully neutral. Mrs. Kim stood there, a polite, almost saccharine smile on her face. "Good morning, Mr. Cha," she said, her voice as smooth as silk. "I'm here for my things." Eun-woo stepped aside, allowing her entry. He watched her, his gaze unwavering, as she moved through the apartment, collecting her belongings. He noticed how efficiently she packed, each movement precise and calculated. There was no sign of remorse, no hint of guilt in her demeanor. It was as if she were simply completing a routine task. Min-jun is in his room, Eun-woo said, his voice low and steady. He's been drawing. Mrs. Kim paused, her hand hovering over a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. Yes, he enjoys his art, she said, her tone dismissive. It's a good way for him to express himself, considering. She trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Eun-woo clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. He would remain calm, collected, and in control. Considering what, Mrs. Kim? He asked, his voice dangerously soft. She turned to face him, her eyes narrowed. Considering his challenges, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. It's not always easy to understand what's going on in his mind, is it? He lives in his own little world. He's more aware than you think, Eun-woo said, his voice rising slightly. He sees things, he feels things, he understands things. And he remembers things. Mrs. Kim chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. What exactly are you implying, Mr. Cha? I'm implying that I know what you've been doing, Eun-woo said, his voice firm. I've seen the security footage. I know how you've been treating my son. The color drained from Mrs. Kim's face. Her eyes widened, and her lips trembled. For the first time since he had opened the door, Eun-woo saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, her voice shaking. You must be mistaken. I would never do anything to harm Min-jun. I love him like he was my own grandson. Don't lie to me, Eun-woo said, his voice hard. I saw you lock him in the closet. I saw the look on your face when he was having a meltdown. I saw the indifference, the disdain, the cruelty. Mrs. Kim's composure crumbled. She sank into a nearby chair, her face buried in her hands. It wasn't like that, she sobbed, her voice muffled. He's a difficult child. He's demanding, he's disruptive, he's impossible to control. I was just trying to help him, to teach him discipline. By locking him in a closet? Eun-woo asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. By ignoring his emotional needs? By making him feel like he's a burden? Mrs. Kim looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean to hurt him, she said, her voice pleading. I lost my patience sometimes. It's not easy caring for a child like Min-jun. It's exhausting, it's frustrating, it's thankless. That's no excuse, Eun-woo said, his voice cold. You were entrusted with the care of my son, and you abused that trust. You betrayed him, and you betrayed me. He paused, taking a deep breath to compose himself. He knew that confronting Mrs. Kim wouldn't undo the damage she had inflicted on Min-jun. But it was a necessary step, a way to hold her accountable for her actions. I want you to leave, Eun-woo said, his voice firm. And I never want you to come near my son again. If you do, I will not hesitate to press charges. Do you understand? Mrs. Kim nodded, her head bowed. She slowly rose to her feet, gathered her remaining belongings, and walked towards the door. As she reached the threshold, she turned to face Eun-woo one last time. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I truly am. Eun-woo didn't respond. He simply watched her as she walked out of the apartment, closing the door behind her. He stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. It was a different kind of silence than he had been used to. It was a silence free of tension, free of anxiety, free of fear. It was a silence that felt safe. He turned and walked towards Min-jun's room, his heart filled with a mixture of relief and resolve. He knew that the healing process would be long and difficult, but he was determined to help his son overcome the trauma he had experienced. He would be there for him every step of the way, providing him with the love, support, and understanding he needed to thrive. He opened the door to Min-jun's room and saw him sitting at his art table, surrounded by crayons and paper. He was deeply engrossed in his drawing, his brow furrowed in concentration. Eun-woo knelt beside him, his eyes filled with tenderness. What are you drawing, Min-jun? He asked, his voice gentle. Min-jun looked up at him, his eyes bright. He smiled, a genuine, unforced smile that warmed Eun-woo's heart. A hero, Min-jun said, his voice clear and strong. The hero protects me. Eun-woo looked at the drawing. It was a simple picture, but it was filled with meaning. It depicted a figure with broad shoulders and a kind face, standing in front of a house. The figure was holding a shield, and a bright light was emanating from it, pushing back the darkness. Eun-woo knew that Min-jun was drawing him. He was the hero, the protector, the one who would always keep him safe. He wrapped his arms around Min-jun, holding him close. "I will always protect you, Min-jun," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "I promise." Min-jun hugged him back, his small body pressed against his. "I know, Appa," he said, his voice soft. "I love you." Eun-woo closed his eyes, his heart overflowing with love. He knew that he still had a long way to go, but he was confident that he and Min-jun could overcome any challenge, as long as they had each other. He pulled back from the hug and looked at Min-jun's drawing again. He noticed something he hadn't seen before. In the corner of the picture, almost hidden from view, was a small, shadowy figure. It was hunched over, its face obscured by darkness. It looked menacing. Eun-woo frowned. He knew that Min-jun often included symbolic elements in his drawings, representing his fears and anxieties. He wondered what this shadowy figure represented. "Who is that, Min-jun?" he asked, pointing to the figure. Min-jun's face clouded over. He looked down at the drawing, his eyes filled with fear. "The monster," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The monster hides in the dark." Eun-woo's heart sank. He realized that Min-jun was still processing the trauma he had experienced with Mrs. Kim. The shadowy figure represented her, the monster who had lurked in the shadows, preying on his vulnerability. He knew that he couldn't erase Min-jun's memories, but he could help him confront his fears and heal from the emotional wounds. He would show him that he was safe, that he was loved, and that he was strong. He picked up a crayon and handed it to Min-jun. "Let's make the hero even stronger," he said, his voice encouraging. "Let's give him a sword, and a shield, and a helmet. Let's make him invincible." Min-jun's eyes lit up. He took the crayon and began to draw, his hand moving with renewed confidence. He added details to the hero, making him bigger, stronger, and more powerful. As they drew together, Eun-woo felt a sense of hope. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but he was determined to help his son overcome his fears and reclaim his life. He would be his hero, his protector, his guide. He would be the father that Min-jun needed, and he would never let him down. The drawing evolved, the hero becoming more and more defined, the shadows shrinking back, losing their power. It was a testament to Min-jun's resilience, and to the power of love and support. Eun-woo knew, looking at the vibrant colors now dominating the page, that they were on the right path. The true villain had been revealed, and now, they could begin to truly heal. Min-jun, emboldened, added a blazing sun to the sky above the hero, its rays pushing back the encroaching darkness even further. He even dared to add a small, almost hesitant smile to the hero's face. Eun-woo felt a lump form in his throat. It was a small detail, but it spoke volumes about Min-jun's growing sense of security. As the sun blazed brighter on the page, Eun-woo's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from his manager, a terse reminder of an upcoming photo shoot. He sighed inwardly. The world outside, the demanding world of celebrity, felt a million miles away from the quiet sanctuary he had created with Min-jun. He silenced the phone, shoving it back into his pocket. "We can finish this later, Min-jun," he said, ruffling his son's hair. "But first, how about we make some cookies?" Min-jun's face lit up. "Chocolate chip?" "Of course, chocolate chip," Eun-woo replied, standing up. He helped Min-jun down from his chair, careful to keep the drawing safe on the table. As they walked towards the kitchen, Eun-woo couldn't shake the lingering feeling of unease. The shadowy figure, the monster as Min-jun called it, was still etched in his mind. He knew that simply removing Mrs. Kim from their lives wouldn't magically erase the fear she had instilled in his son. The afternoon was filled with the comforting rhythm of baking. The scent of warm butter and sugar filled the air, and Min-jun, his initial anxieties seemingly forgotten, chattered happily as he helped measure ingredients and sprinkle chocolate chips. Eun-woo watched him, his heart swelling with love and a fierce protectiveness. Later, as Min-jun drifted off to sleep, clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur, Eun-woo returned to the drawing. He studied it carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the shadowy figure, something he was missing. He took a closer look at the placement of the figure. It wasn't just in the corner, it was positioned slightly behind the house in the drawing, almost as if it were lurking, observing. And then, it hit him. The house. It wasn't just any house, it was their house. A chill ran down his spine. He remembered Mrs. Kim's unsettling habit of watching Min-jun, her gaze often lingering a beat too long, her expression unreadable. He had dismissed it as mere attentiveness, but now, looking at the drawing, he saw it for what it truly was, surveillance. He felt a surge of anger, hot and visceral. How dare she? How dare she invade their home, violate their trust, and instill such fear in his innocent child? He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. He needed to know more. He needed to understand the full extent of Mrs. Kim's actions, the true nature of her malevolence. He knew he couldn't rely on his own observations alone, he had been too blinded by his own guilt and insecurities to see the truth. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling slightly. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for, Detective Park. He had met him a few years ago at a charity event, and they had struck up an unlikely friendship. He knew that Detective Park was a man of integrity and compassion, someone he could trust. He hesitated for a moment, then pressed the call button. He knew that involving the police would open up a whole can of worms, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. He had to protect Min-jun, no matter the cost. Detective Park answered on the third ring. Eun-woo. What's up? Haven't heard from you in ages. Eun-woo took a deep breath. I need your help, he said, his voice low and urgent. It's about my son. He spent the next hour recounting his suspicions about Mrs. Kim, carefully explaining Min-jun's drawing and the unsettling feeling he couldn't shake. Detective Park listened patiently, asking clarifying questions and offering words of reassurance. I understand your concerns, Eun-woo, Detective Park said finally. I'll look into it. I can't promise anything, but I'll see if there's anything to your suspicions. Eun-woo hung up the phone, feeling a sliver of relief. He had taken the first step, but he knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous. He just hoped that he wasn't too late. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Eun-woo tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy for Min-jun's sake, but he found himself constantly on edge, jumping at every unexpected sound, scrutinizing every shadow. He kept Min-jun close, showering him with affection and reassurance. They spent their days drawing, playing games, and reading stories. He even attempted to teach Min-jun some basic self-defense moves, just in case. He knew it was probably overkill, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched, that Mrs. Kim was still lurking somewhere in the shadows. Then, 3 days after his call to Detective Park, his phone rang. It was Detective Park. Eun-woo's heart pounded in his chest. He answered the phone, his voice barely a whisper. Detective Park? Eun-woo, Detective Park said, his voice grave. I think you need to come down to the station. Eun-woo's blood ran cold. What is it? He asked, his voice trembling. What did you find? It's better if I explain in person, Detective Park said. Just come as soon as you can. Eun-woo hung up the phone, his mind racing. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew it couldn't be good. He glanced at Min-jun, who was happily playing with his toys, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside his father. He knew he couldn't leave Min-jun alone. He called his close friend and fellow actor, Kim Soo-hyun, explaining the situation and asking him to watch Min-jun for a few hours. Soo-hyun, without hesitation, agreed. As he drove to the police station, Eun-woo's thoughts were a chaotic jumble of fear, anger, and determination. He was prepared to do whatever it took to protect his son, even if it meant facing the darkest corners of his own past. At the station, Detective Park led him to a small, windowless room. He sat down at a table, his face grim. He placed a file in front of Eun-woo. We ran a background check on Mrs. Kim, Detective Park said. Her real name isn't Kim. It's Lee Bora. And she has a history. Eun-woo opened the file, his hands trembling. He scanned the documents, his eyes widening in disbelief. Lee Bora had a long record of fraud, theft, and even assault. She had worked for several families in the past, each time leaving behind a trail of broken trust and financial ruin. But that wasn't the worst of it. As he delved deeper into the file, he discovered something even more disturbing. Lee Bora had a history of targeting vulnerable children, children with disabilities or special needs. She would gain their trust, manipulate them, and exploit them for her own gain. Eun-woo felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He closed the file, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He couldn't believe that he had allowed such a dangerous person into his home, into his son's life. There's more, Detective Park said, his voice somber. We found some disturbing images on her computer. Images of Min-jun. Eun-woo's blood ran cold. What kind of images? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Detective Park hesitated for a moment. Images of him sleeping, playing, even bathing. They were taken without his knowledge or consent. Eun-woo felt a surge of rage so intense that he thought he might explode. He stood up from the table, his fists clenched. Where is she? He demanded, his voice shaking with fury. I want to see her. We haven't been able to locate her yet, Detective Park said. She seems to have disappeared. Eun-woo slammed his fist on the table. Find her, he roared. Find her and bring her to justice. Detective Park nodded grimly. We're doing everything we can, he said. But we need your help. We need you to tell us everything you know about her, everything she did, everything she said. Eun-woo spent the next several hours answering questions, recounting every interaction he had with Mrs. Kim, every detail, no matter how insignificant it seemed. He felt a sense of shame and guilt as he realized how easily he had been manipulated, how blind he had been to the danger lurking beneath the surface. As he left the police station, exhausted and emotionally drained, he knew that the fight was far from over. Lee Bora was still out there, a threat to Min-jun and to other vulnerable children. He had to find her, not just for his son's sake, but for the sake of every child she had harmed and every child she might harm in the future.